Now before we get into making the coziest, most comforting, most soul-satisfying gift that Italy has given the world, the famous tortellini and brodo from Emilia Romagna, we must first start making the brodo di carne, which I started yesterday. Now, as one of the all-time most comforting dishes ever created by man, this is a recipe that takes a little bit of time. That's called love. So if you're not ready to pour love into a dish, don't even make this recipe. But the reason we're starting a day earlier is to show this recipe love. And that brings us to making the brodo di carne. Traditionally, it's used with a capon or a turkey. I'm gonna use chicken today, along with a beef shank with the beef bone in it, along with some marrow bones. This is gonna act as a base. It's a blend of chicken and beef. Traditionally, it's probably just an economical way to use whatever's left over in a brodo or a broth. Now, because we want a nice, light, clear stock, we will not be roasting any of them. Traditionally, you just take the meat and you place it in the pot. Then in goes the beef shank along with the marrow bones. I've also got some leftover scraps from chicken wings, so I'm just gonna get those in as well. And then we want to get it onto the stove and bring it up to a very gentle simmer, never a boil. And you're going to see all these particles start floating to the top and settling on top of the broth. That's what we call the scum, and whenever you see that, we want to strain it out. And once that broth is gently simmering and a lot of the scum has been cleaned up, now we can add the vegetables. Now, I forgot to turn the camera on to cut all of these, but it's really not too complicated. We just have 1 onion, 1 carrot, 2 celery stalks. Those are the traditional aromatics in this without any sort of herbs, which you don't really find traditionally, although you could add them. And then I had some garlic to use, so I just cut a head in half. And this is really all we need in terms of vegetables and aromatics that we can just add into the stock now that a lot of the scum has sort of been removed, so we don't have to kind of fuss around these little pieces to clean up the stock. Now there's still gonna be scum that rises to the top, and you will wanna skim that off, but it's sort of why we give it time before adding the vegetables. It's just much harder to skim when those vegetables are now in the pot. So now we're gonna let that cook at a very, very gentle simmer while we work on the rest of the recipe. So now while that is on the stove, simmering nice and gently, might as well start making the pasta. And we're making an egg dough today, so that's always nice to let sit overnight in the refrigerator to allow it to hydrate completely, although using it the same day is totally fine. So first we're gonna go in with about 258 grams of whole egg. Usually ends up being at least 5 eggs, but it probably takes you a little over 260. And in that case, we'll just adjust with some flour. Next up, 454 grams of 00 flour. Get the Caputo or an Italian flour, it's just much better. Then you want to pour the flour onto the board and create a well, and then beat the eggs up and pour that into that well. We're going to use a fork and a bench scraper, and at first we're going to just use that fork to beat the eggs while slowly incorporating the flour from the walls until it becomes a thick pancake-like batter consistency. Then we can switch over to the bench scraper, and I want to start to pull some of the flour into the egg mixture, using the bench scraper to scrape underneath the dough and to try and get some flour underneath, and then just continue cutting the flour into the dough, allowing that flour to hydrate. Then I'll start using my bench scraper to almost begin kneading the dough until I can start kneading it cleanly with my hands. Then I'm just gonna go ahead and knead this dough for about 5 minutes. I can tell that the dough is properly hydrated, so I'm gonna scrape all of the flour off of the board and start kneading on a clean board. And after about 5 minutes of kneading, the dough should be a lot smoother, and then we can wrap it up and allow it to rest for about 20 to 30 minutes to continue hydrating. After that rest period, we can check back in on the dough. It's a lot softer, it's more moist and hydrated, and it's gonna be a lot easier for us to now knead further to create more gluten. Knead for another 3 to 5 minutes until the dough is even smoother. And then I want to cut the dough in half. And because we're going to be rolling this out by hand, I'm going to create 2 smaller pieces of dough. I'm just going to knead each of those pieces of dough for 3 minutes each just to create a nice dense ball of pasta. And then I'm going to take each piece of that dough and wrap them tightly with these pleats. And you're using these tight pleats to just keep the circular shape of the dough, so when we roll it out, we get a nice circular sheet of pasta. Now into the fridge, they'll go to rest until we're ready to use them tomorrow. Now that stock is still going, we're gonna clean it up a little bit, and then we're gonna let that go for a full 24 hours. You can let it go for 12 or all day. And then after 24 hours, it looks like this. It's reduced, it's clear, it's got a little bit of scum to clean up, but now we can turn the heat off, allow the contents of the broth to settle, and then we can strain it out through a fine mesh strainer into a bowl. But don't disturb it, just gently dip your ladle in and pull out stock so that we can keep it nice and clear. And then then what I like to do is take that liquid and put that through a fat separator. And if there's any fat, it'll separate to the top, and then I can easily transfer that liquid into quart containers. And if you've got some sediment floating, you can use a cheesecloth to further purify it, and then we can label it and get those into the refrigerator until we're ready to use them. I wrote chicken broth by accident because I'm dyslexic. So now we've got our pasta dough chilled overnight. With an egg dough, we can't just take this out of the refrigerator and start working it. Technically you could, but you don't want to. So what we need to do is let this come down to room temperature before we can easily roll it out by hand. Now, while our dough tempers, we can get started on the filling, or as it's called in Italian, ripieno. Ripieno just means a filling. Now, Emilia Romagna is located north of Tuscany, and it is a region that has gifted the world some of the greatest food known to man, including but not limited to Parmigiano Reggiano, prosciutto di Parma, mortadella, balsamic vinegar, tortellini, lasagna, tagliatelle bolognese, and of course, tortellini and brodo. And this dish takes some of the best that region has to offer and puts them into one legendary bowl of comfort. So to make this filling, we're gonna need 12 ounces of prosciutto di Parma, 8 ounces of mortadella, 8 ounces of ground pork, about a cup or so of Parmigiano Reggiano, nutmeg, 1 egg, butter, and some wine. Only thing we need to cook is the pork. Traditionally, they might use a pork loin or a pork shoulder, but I think ground pork works just fine, so I like to use that. Now to a hot pan, we're gonna add some butter, and we wanna brown that butter. So once it melts, cook it until the butter changes to a nice golden brown and has a nutty aroma, and then we can add the pork. Season the pork with salt, break it up into small bits so there's more surface area to brown. We can season with a little bit of fresh cracked black pepper. And once the meat is browned and you get a bunch of caramelization on the bottom of the pan, then we can deglaze with some white wine. And we can take a flat bottomed wooden spoon and just clean up the bottom of the pan until there's just a little bit of liquid left, and we can get the pork with all of its juices into a bowl to cool slightly. So now we have the filling ingredients. The pork, the prosciutto, the mortadella, the egg, the nutmeg, and the cheese. So we're just going to add the mortadella and the prosciutto into the food processor and then start to process them into a rough paste. Then with a spatula, we can clean the inside, add the pork and all its juices, and then continue zipping it until it becomes like a homogeneous mix. Then we can add in 1 egg, the Parmigiano Reggiano, a little bit of nutmeg, and some fresh cracked black pepper. And then continue to puree it until it all comes together into a nice, workable, homogeneous mixture. And then we can set that aside until we're ready to use it. Now today we're going extra old school. We're going that extra step for a little extra love and rolling this sfoglia out by hand. This is called pasta fatto a mano. Pasta made by hand, no machine. And this is a mattarello. This is the tool you use to roll out a large sheet of sfoglia. And this is called the Sicilian slugger. The mattarello made in the style of an American baseball bat. I'm gonna leave a link down to where you can get this guy. It's a wood shop on Etsy. The guy does great work. Now the reason we cut the dough in half is because if we didn't, most people don't really have a wood work surface big enough to roll that sheet out properly. We cut it into smaller pieces so that I can kind of basically get it to the size of this cutting board and I won't have any issues. And all of this learning really came from Evan Funke, who is a guy in America who is famous for making pasta fatto a mano. Now take it out of the plastic and just use your hand and just flatten it out almost like you would a pizza dough. And then using the mattarello, we're gonna roll away from us and turn 90 degrees, using even pressure to roll the dough flat. Making sure that you don't roll over the dough edge to create a little flat piece like I just did here. It's gonna be fine, but you just wanna make sure you avoid that. And my dough is a little dry, so I do not need flour to dry it out further, but if you do, you should use a little bit at a time. And then as it gets flatter, it's easier to roll, and you're kind of positioning your hands and rolling forward, and while pushing forward, your hands are meeting at the end, almost following the curvature of the dough. And once it gets big enough, you can fold the dough over the rolling pin, roll it up, and then turn it in order to keep moving it around the board so that we can maintain a nice even shape. And then instead of just rolling forward, we can roll at each diagonal to try and keep that circular shape going as we roll out this dough. And you can even let some of it overhang on the board. It creates like a little bit of tension to help it stretch even further. And we want to keep rolling it until we can see through it, or until it's about this thickness of a 4 to 5 Post-it notes. Then I've got this pasta cutter here that can cut 4 lines at a time. It might be called a tortellini wheel or a pasta bicycle. And they're measured at 1¼ inches, so we'll have 1¼ inch squares. And I'm gonna cut the dough horizontally, and then I'm gonna cut the dough vertically, and then I'm gonna pull off all of the uneven shape and all of the strips of dough that you can't make tortellini with. Then cover all the squares with plastic because they're gonna dry out by the second, and we don't want them to dry out too fast. So this will prevent them from drying out too fast. It's like a little nut-sized piece of the filling. And only expose the amount of squares you're comfortable working with at a time before drying them out. And then to form the tortellini, you're gonna take the 2 points and meet them at the top and pinch it. So now that the 2 pieces that meet that were double thickness now are pressed into a single thickness, so that will cook properly. And then you take the sides and you push the air out. And again, you push that double thickness into a single thickness. And then you wrap around your index finger. And again, those 2 points that met were now 2 pieces that were met. So now that's 4 thicknesses now have to be pressed down into a single thickness. And so now you have a channel for water to flow through. It's sealed, it's beautifully shaped. It's a perfect tortellino. And if they ever get dried out a little bit, you can just give it a spritz of water, and that should be enough to seal it. Now there is a more advanced way to shape a tortellini, but this is a very basic beginner level tortellini that I feel like everyone can achieve. Let's just say you get to the point where you can get it all the way to this point. You can make a triangle, you can squeeze the air out, but when it comes to twisting it around your finger, maybe your fingers are too fat, but it, for some reason it just doesn't reach. A little cheat that you could do is to just meet the 2 points, squeeze it together, and then you get a little variation of the tortellino. It's a little easier to make, and I think it looks really pretty. So you can kind of do whichever shape you like. That one's a little cheat. Probably some people wouldn't say that's a tortellini or a tortellino, but at least you can make it. But you should be able to wrap it around your finger. And once you get the shape down, you really got to start to move fast, or just work with smaller amounts of the dough at a time. Once they start drying out, they become a lot harder to shape. The tortellini are considered a luxurious food, usually served during the holidays. And like I said, this is a true labor of love. So it's a perfect time to get a few people in the family or some friends to help you make these and to bang them out a lot faster. Those are, after all, the best experiences in the kitchen. These are sometimes referred to as navels. The legend goes that a chef created it after seeing the goddess Venus and decided to model it after her belly button. It's the most Italian thing you've ever heard. See, I saw a goddess once and I was inspired by her belly button. I call them tortellini. I'm always amused by these stories and legends of the creation and origins of some of these dishes. And though a lot of them I'm sure are not entirely accurate, I'm a sucker for a good story. Okay, we are done. At least this is half the batch. And that's all that we're gonna be making today. So now all that's left to do is cook these guys in our brodo. Tortellini in brodo. I'm gonna get my 3-quart saucier, I'm gonna pour the broth right into it and bring it up to a simmer. And now it's an unseasoned broth, so we've got to add salt. And we're gonna allow that to dissolve, and then we're gonna give it a taste and see where we're at. We need a little bit more salt. So I'm gonna just adjust it and get it to the point where when I taste it, it tastes like a beautiful, delicious seasoned broth. Then once it's simmering, we can add the tortellini and we can cook it for about 3 to 5 minutes. But I'm just really looking for the outside, those points that we sealed together, to be sure that those parts are cooked. Once it's cooked, we're ready to plate. And I like to add a little knob of butter to the bottom of the plate and then start spooning in the tortellini. And I like a wide, shallow bowl so I can have a nice single layer of the tortellini and just a shallow pool of broth to cover them. Then we can hit it with some fresh grated Parmigiano Reggiano, and we can taste one of the most magical, legendary dishes that Italy has ever created. Mortadella, prosciutto, Parmigiano Reggiano, rich meat broth. The weather's starting to cool down, and unlike something like pastina, that is like really great when you're sick, this is great every single night. Visually looks simple, but all the depth of flavor of all those powerful, legendary ingredients, it just pops with flavor. And in a dish like this, every ingredient counts. This is, without a doubt, an Italian Hall of Fame dish. Recipe's gonna be down in the description. That's all that I got today. I'll see you next time. Until then, take care of yourself and go feed yourself.